Hi, everybody. This is Bruce Bewald with Synapse Energy Economics. Welcome to our October webinar. We're doing webinars on the third Thursday of each month at 2. So if you want to, you can mark your calendar now for November 16th. We will have a 2 o'clock webinar on some interesting energy analysis related topic yet to be determined. Today's topic, though, will be Tim Wolf talking about the National Standard Practice Manual for Energy Efficiency Cost Effectiveness. Utilities have been offering efficiency programs for several decades, and as long as they've been offering programs, there's been an issue of how do you figure out what to do, what's cost effective, what's good, what's bad, what's too expensive, and so on. And for years, the California Standard Practice approach has been kind of the standard used and abused over the years. We think that now it's out of date and inadequate and needs to be replaced. This National Standard Practice approach that Tim describes today, we think is just a thing to replace it. Before we jump in, though, logistics of the webinar, you should know this is being recorded, and it will be circulated to all of you, a link to the video, so that you'll have the slides and video later on to share or watch or whatever. Also, you have all been muted on entry to the webinar, and you're going to stay muted, sorry. We just find it's a better way to run this. But any questions and comments that you have, you can email. So as you go along, email any questions, please ask questions, to webinar@synapse-energy.com. So we'll field those questions in real time and pass them along to Tim Wolf to respond to. There are also, for any kind of technical difficulties you're having, please use the chat feature of the webinar. You can ask questions in the chat feature, but it's not, we might miss them. We'll try not to, but we might. Yeah, I guess here we go. Tim Wolf, take it away.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to start with a question we get asked often, which is why a new cost effectiveness manual? What's the reason for putting this together? One of the reasons is that the traditional tests that have been used in the past, the utility cost test, total resource cost test, societal cost test, there are several issues with those. They don't address policy goals, not directly. There's often a lack of clarity on their constructs and how they should be used. It only really leaves 3 options, and I don't know about you, but I've been involved in many states where there's this battle, like which one is the right one for us? Is it the utility cost test? And there's no easy solution if you just rely on this California manual. Many states have modified the tests, which is okay, except that it's not always done well. So we tried to put together a manual that helps guide those kind of processes. And and when I say we, I'm referring to several authors and the project funders, which I'll get to in a minute. But we've experienced across the country that in a lot of jurisdictions, efficiency is not valued accurately. Many don't account for all impacts, especially those that are relative to policy objectives. Many don't account for the full range of the utility system benefits. There's sometimes an asymmetrical application of the costs and benefits. This especially happens with regards to participant impacts, which we'll talk a lot more about. Often defaulting to the utility weighted average cost to capital for discount rates is, it doesn't account for some very important considerations. And then there's issues around net savings and so forth. And also there's a lack of transparency on why the tests were chosen, how they were developed. Sometimes people seem to just pick them because that's how it's been done for years without really going through the process to decide what makes the most sense for their jurisdiction. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the process. First, there's this group of people called the National Efficiency Screening Project. It's a group of national organizations to improve energy efficiency cost effectiveness. It's got so far over 75 organizations representing a range of perspectives. If you want to join in this particular effort, you're welcome to do so. You can find more information at a website I'm going to give you soon. The manual that I'm going to be talking about was written by 5 people. You might know some of these folks. We tried to pick experts from all over the country with different perspectives and different sort of roles. So in addition to myself, we had Chris Nemi, Marty Kushler, Steve Schiller, and Tom Ekman helping to write the manual. And then we had a review committee. We wanted to get a lot of stakeholder input and a lot of back and forth to make sure there's buy-in. So we had 40 different experts providing their input to the manual. And then the coordination and funding, a lot of this has come by E for the Future. Julie Michaels has been helping to manage the whole process, and the NESP has done a couple of years' worth of work under the Home Performance Coalition before we get to the manual. And there you can see at the bottom the website for a whole lot more information, as well as the manual itself and various slide decks and so forth. And that's where you can sign up if you want to join. And also, if you forget this particular URL, you just go to Google and type in National Standard Practice Manual. It'll take you there. So, purpose and scope. The idea here is to set forth relatively neutral principles for developing a test and applying the test. We don't put forward a set of specific recommendations. We try to lay out concepts and principles that each jurisdiction can use to make the decisions for themselves. One of the key things is we create a framework for coming up with a primary test that's used to select energy efficiency. I'll talk a lot more about that. And then provide guidance on key inputs and applications. And scope here is important. This was intentionally designed to focus on energy efficiency resources, those where customers are paying to their utilities or their program administrators to implement efficiency programs, and there's some sort of a regulator or some other kind of a board overseeing how the funds are used and which programs should be implemented. Now, we note that the principles, the concepts in here can also be applied to other types of distributed energy resources, but we decided for the sake of keeping this manageable and focused not to cover those other resources because they do raise other issues that are beyond the scope of what we wanted to cover here. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't provide any specific answer, but we give you the tools and the approaches to come up with one on your own. And we use the term jurisdiction here to mean really not just any one state, but also maybe a province, maybe a municipal utility, maybe it means a power authority, any jurisdiction that oversees energy efficiency programs. So here we have just a brief outline of the manual so you know what's there. The part one is the most important. It gets at how one should develop their primary test. And I'm going to talk mostly about that for the next half an hour or so. And by the way, I'm going to leave time for Q&A at the end, and a couple points I'm going to pause and see if you have questions as we go. Part two covers various inputs that you might use in the test that you come up with. And as you can see on the screen, we cover various inputs. Some of the ones I'll highlight are participant impacts and discount rates because they're fairly challenging, and I think we offer some good ideas there for how to address those inputs. And then for the appendices, we cover some additional issues. I would bring your attention to Appendix C, which is accounting for rate and bill impacts. It's basically a way to recognize that rate and bill impacts are important, but rather than using the rate impact measure test, there are better ways to come up with those. And if we have time, I might cover that appendix. If not, I suggest you take a look if that topic is of interest to you. So I'm going to pause just right there. I'm going to check to see if we see anything in terms of like the reason for doing this. No, I guess no questions yet. Okay.
Well, I would, you mentioned other research like solar or distributed resources. Is there any effort underway, or do you anticipate that this will be extended to other resources besides DE?
Yeah, so what I can say is that there are many states, many dockets around the country where the issues around cost effectiveness for other DERs are at play, especially rooftop PV, distributed solar. It's a hot topic around the country, and cost effectiveness is a big issue there. So there's a huge need for coming up with some kind of manual to do the same thing there. And the group, the National Standard Efficiency Project, is looking to do that. They're looking for funding, they're looking for people to help out, and so that is sort of on their agenda. It hasn't been set up specifically yet, but that's on the agenda.
But for your comments today, you're really talking about energy efficiency.
Yes.
Okay, great.
So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on part one, and here what we do is we lay out some universal principles that should be used in any cost effectiveness test. And then we create what we call a framework just to provide a step-by-step approach for jurisdictions to come up with what we call the primary test. And by that, I mean many states will run their models and come up with values for maybe even all 5 of the standard tests, but at least the utility cost test, the PRC test. And, you know, they might even say, oh, yeah, we look at them all. But usually when push comes to shove and there's a program or something that's on the margin, there's usually a primary test that is used to make the decision for those tough calls. And that's what we're talking about here, is that one primary test. So walk through, we've got 6 principles here. Some of these are no-brainers, but some of them are actually fairly new, and they're all important. One is to recognize that efficiency is a resource. And believe it or not, there are some states where this isn't really fully done, and sometimes efficiency programs are seen as just a giveaway to a handful of customers to keep them happy, but not really a means to be able to avoid, defer, and save money on alternative resources, especially costly supply-side resources. And there are important implications of your screening if you recognize this. Principle 2 is a big one. It's probably the biggest one. It's to account for applicable policy goals in coming up with your test. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this in a few minutes. And I will say that this is one of the reasons why the California Standard Practice Manual doesn't really give us what we need. If you look at the manual, and I've looked at it way too many times, there's one page where they explicitly say, we're not talking about policy goals in this manual. It's just outside the scope, but no question policy goals are important when coming up with your test. So it was basically a gap in that manual that we're trying to fill. Third principle, account for all relevant costs and benefits, even if they're hard to quantify. Concept there is there are many states out there where there's costs or benefits that are recognized, understood, but because the numbers are too uncertain or hard to come up with, they just ignore them. And our point is you can't do that, and we'll talk more later about how to come up with reasonable values. Fourth is to ensure symmetry across costs and benefits. We'll come back to that in a couple of ways. Fifth is to conduct forward-looking, long-term analysis that captures incremental impacts. And there's actually a lot in that. I'll come back to that one as well. And then finally, ensure transparency in presenting the analysis and the results. In a lot of states we've worked in, first of all, the impacts and the decision-making, the implications of the tests are just not defined, and they're fine, and you get numbers, and then you go with it. And we're suggesting that, no, this whole process needs to be transparent. So then we have what we call the resource value framework, and this is the framework that one can go through to come up with a primary screening test. And you'll see the steps here pretty much mirror the principles I just went through. There's a couple of important differences. And many states have already done some of these steps, and we're not suggesting that every state has to do every one of these, but we like to provide the complete framework for those who want to sort of walk through it and make sure that they've covered everything. The idea here is the first step is to identify and articulate the applicable policy goals, and that's hugely important because it then has ramifications for the several steps later on. Step 2 is to include all utility system costs and benefits, and behind that is the notion that the utility system costs and benefits should be included in any test. No matter which one you choose, how you shape them, those are like the foundation. And so that should be where you start, and make sure that you have them all. But then the step 3 is a big one, and the most challenging one is to decide which additional non-utility system costs and benefits to include in the test. And here, this decision should be based upon your policy goals that you outlined in step 1. And then walk through to ensure the test is symmetrical, ensure that it's forward-looking, incremental, long-term, develop methodologies and inputs to account for all impacts, including the hard-to-quantify impacts, and then ensure transparency. So what I'm going to do now is walk through these 7 steps with the more details so that you can get a sense of really what we're talking about and how some of these might apply to you or your jurisdiction. Step 1, this sounds kind of obvious, but not a lot of states do it. And it's really to make sure that as you're discussing your cost-effectiveness test, that you have a good sense of what your goals are. There may be several sources of those goals. They could include laws, regulations, previous orders, efficiency guidelines, efficiency standards. And what this slide 9 is showing is just one example of how one might lay out in the rows the various sources of the goals in this particular example. And then the columns show what some of the goals might be and where they come up in those various sources. And the idea here is that each jurisdiction has its own constellation of goals, and that it's really incumbent upon them to put those together to get a sense of what they want to achieve with their efficiency screening, especially the primary screening test.
Do you ever find, Tim, that the different laws, regulations, and orders have conflicting goals or different, it's just different kinds of that have to be reconciled? And if so, what would you do? How would you handle that? Or how would you think about it?
Yes, no question. And not only that, but as people who work with regulatory settings know, even statutes have conflicting requirements in them. And so one of the jobs of regulators and the people who work with them and before them is statutory interpretation. And it might also apply to how you interpret orders or how you might interpret regs. And even then, there might be just a short sentence about how in the IRP, for example, the utility should account for environmental benefits. But what does that mean? So there's really a lot that needs to be done even once you've kind of got your laws and your regulations in front of you. We recommend that what's key there is that there be a process where those discussions happen. So rather than just assuming, oh, I'm going to pick this test, what do different parties think about what this statute requires and how is it going to flow through into our test?
So we're talking a lot about process and discussions in those important conversations. And but in terms of going through these steps, can you describe, like what we have here is a table with X's in the boxes, but what would the outcome, if a state goes through this in a good, thorough way and has those conversations and process, what would the result of that look like? Would it be another table with numbers in it or something else?
Well, I could see if there is a process in any one jurisdiction for either updating or applying their cost-effectiveness test, and there might be a working through process, or it might be through a commission docket with an order. Either there could be straw proposals put forward, or the commission might write it up in this order, where they lay out, okay, here are the goals that we think energy efficiency should achieve, and here's why, based upon these particular regulations, and lay it out. And sometimes that happens, but we're making sure that it happens as a part of the decision of which test to use. That's the key link we're trying to make.
Thanks.
So step 2 is to include all utility system costs and benefits. And here on the slide 10, we list most of them. We may have missed one or two, but the idea is to really try to make sure you've got all of them in there. Some of these are no-brainers that are included everywhere, but some of them are less frequently included, like reduced risk or increased reliability, but those are benefits that are widely recognized as real. And the question is, should and how should you capture those in your test? But the idea is, if it's a utility benefit, it's got to be there. So step 3, the big one, a couple of points on this. As I said earlier, the goals can be established in many different ways. There might be overarching goals that need to be interpreted. There might be specific efficiency goals. We provide some examples here, and as we just talked about a minute ago in the Q&A, that there might need to be a process for interpreting these to see how they apply to energy efficiency. And here, slide 12, we're still on step 3. This step requires, okay, going through the options for non-utility system impacts and deciding, okay, which ones do we include in our test in our jurisdictions? Which ones are relevant for us? And this table shows a list of several of them. There may be others, but these are the big ones. And I'm just going to walk through them briefly. You can read the descriptions. One of the more challenging ones is the participant impacts. And the way this is played out in the past is, if you want to include those, you pick the TRC test and you're done. We suggest give it a little bit more thought. In the manual, we talk about pros and cons of doing this. And I'll also talk a little bit later on that if you do choose to include participant impacts, you have to include both costs and benefits. Impacts on low-income customers. It's a widely used impact that people want to include in their tests. It's a decision that should be made based upon the policy goals. Impacts on other fuels, that includes things like oil, propane, wood, or if you're electric utility, saving gas and vice versa. Whether to include those is a question, and it's sometimes a tough question. Again, we'll get back to that in a little bit. Impacts on water consumption, environmental impacts, you all know that's a big one. And whether that should be included, again, should be an explicit discussion and decision. Public health impacts, similar but different from environmental. Jobs and economic development is sort of a issue that pretty much every state, most jurisdictions are interested in. And then there's energy security, meaning reliance on fuel imports from outside the jurisdiction, the state, the region, or the country.
So far, Tim, up through step 3, it's really just deciding kind of what's important and what categories and impacts to consider in the test and consideration of EE cost effectiveness. You haven't really commented yet on kind of how to measure them or or how to include them, right? This is just kind of an inventory of what are the possible things that you care about and which are you really going to focus on.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And one of the things that's new in our manual is that each jurisdiction has the flexibility to choose among these. In the past, what so many people have thought of is, well, if you choose the TRC test, then you have to include X, Y, Z. And if you choose the societal cost test, you have to include all these. And if you include the utility cost test, you can include none of these. So it's like, and that's simply not the case. There's no economic theory that requires that. We argue that as long as you're consistent with the principles and the concepts here, then you can pick and choose among these as long as you have the policy rationale for doing so. So that's a new thing, and it really helps open up the discussion about what the primary test should be for this purpose. Symmetry. So this might seem obvious, but it's frequently not achieved. That is, if a certain cost is included, you've got to include the benefits. One of the big issues is participant costs. So the vast majority of states in the country use a total resource cost test, which includes all participant costs. Very few of them, the vast minority, or the minority, excuse me, include participant benefits, and that would mean participant non-energy benefits. And one of the reasons is that the participant non-energy benefits, they are difficult to quantify. There's some uncertainty. There's questions about whether they're relevant. But the many states that have addressed this recognize that they're real, they're significant, they can make a difference. And if you're going to include the costs, you have to include the benefits. And the key here is that if you don't, you're going to have a bias, just an inherent bias in your test. Either you're going to favor the test, bias favor the test in favor of efficiency, or bias against efficiency. And the thing is, either way, you get a misallocation of resources. Either way, customers are paying higher than necessary costs to meet their energy needs, and nobody wants that. So our main point here is avoid the bias, ensure the symmetry, and make sure that you've got a balanced test. The next step, incremental, forward-looking, long-term analysis. So incremental has to do with, what would have occurred absent the energy efficiency investment. And this is really just a principle that needs to be applied as you're coming up with your avoided costs to make sure that, you're doing your avoided cost calculation correctly. And most states do this well. We include it here just to be complete. The next one, forward-looking, is actually the most challenging one. Here, this gets to the whole issue of rate impacts from energy efficiency. And as many of you know, the California Standard Practice Manual has one of the tests in there is called the rate impact measure test. And it differs from the other tests in that it includes the recovery of lost revenues. And it assumes that the revenues that are lost from reduced sales are a cost, and they add it into the other costs and the benefits. And we argue that that is a flawed approach. There are actually many reasons why the rate impact measure test doesn't work for this purpose, but specifically it's flawed because the lost revenues are really a reflection, or they're necessary to recover sunk costs that have been incurred historically. And basic economic theory says that when you're doing an analysis of where to invest your future dollars, historic costs are not relevant and therefore shouldn't be included. So this is, if you're going to comply with this principle, and at this step, it suggests that the RIM test should not be used. However, as I mentioned earlier, in Appendix C, we talk about other ways to look at rate and bill impacts that are much better than the RIM test. And we can get to that in a few minutes if we have time. And the third one here is long-term analysis. It should cover the full life cycle costs and benefits. You might be surprised to hear that there are some states who don't do that, but it's worth stating and making sure it happens. And so if you've got programs that have long-term lives, or even retrofits or new energy construction programs, you have to have at least 20 years, maybe even 30 years to your analysis. So step 6 is about methodologies and inputs to account for all impacts. And this gets to your question earlier, Bruce. We provide a little bit of information on this in the manual. To do a thorough discussion of this requires like another document because there's so much to it. But we do have lots of references people can use, and we do provide some general ideas. And I'm going to just walk through a few of them. The best way to come up with methodologies and inputs for coming up with these impacts are to do jurisdiction-specific studies. Hire independent consultant to come up with an approach for your specific region. And by the way, I should just explain, these approaches can be used for all of the impacts we've just described. Most utilities, most states use jurisdiction-specific studies for the core costs and benefits, avoided energy costs, avoided capacity costs, so forth. Where it gets harder, and one might need to go further down this list, is the non-energy benefits. And so our advice is generally to some of those benefits that are less well studied. Anyway, another option is to take studies from other jurisdictions. Sometimes you can extrapolate from one jurisdiction to another if a local study isn't available. And there's a lot that can be done with it. Even if numbers are uncertain, you still might be able to get a reasonably good number using that approach. And then there are several states that use proxies for hard-to-quantify impacts. And it's not meant to be just a wild guess or picking something out of the air. It's meant to be an informed estimate based upon all the information that's available. So even if you can't get, for example, the benefits to increase productivity as a result of participating in efficiency programs, you might be able to come up with at least a proxy to use for that by increasing your avoided cost by a certain amount. And I know that sometimes this is done for low-income benefits, sometimes it's done for non-energy benefits. It's there. It's not ideal, but it's available. Another option is just use a different threshold. Maybe if you recognize there are certain benefits that you haven't quantified, then you don't have to hold yourself to a 1.0 threshold for benefit-cost ratio, but you could accept programs that might be below that, recognizing the benefits that are not included in that narrow ratio. And then the last one's actually fairly important, which is to be open to quantitative and qualitative information that might not be monetary, but still is relevant and should not be ignored. And there's a lot of examples of this. And the whole point, and you might see this as a theme throughout our manual, is that people shouldn't be held to such a high standard of quantifying everything that they meet that standard but thereby miss out on important costs and benefits. That it's actually better to take qualitative considerations than just assume that they're zero. And so we walk through several examples in the manual of how one can do this, where you start with all the monetary data that you have, lay it out there, make sure all of it's transparent and understood. And then for any impacts where you don't have monetary data, you lay out something that's maybe quantitative but not monetary. And then maybe there's something where you lay out something qualitative that's not monetary. And if you have a program that's on the margin and it looks like it may not be cost effective, you take a look at those and factor them in. And I will say that as sort of obvious as this seems, it's remarkable how over many decades of energy efficiency work, so few commissions are willing to do this. For some reason, for energy efficiency, they need this extremely high standard of everything being monetized. Meanwhile, I've noticed in my grid mod work that proposals for AMI or proposals for smart grid investments, that there's no similar standard, that the term they use is a business case, where you do just exactly what I've said here, which is you start with a quantified and monetized, and then you take into account other considerations as relevant.
Ken, why do you think that is, that commissions are so hesitant or reluctant to consider non-quantitative information, if that's what you mean?
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of me thinks it stems from the origins here. So way back when energy efficiency was first put forth as something utilities should invest in, the logic was that if it's cost effective, you should do it, right? It's going to save you money, so therefore you should do it. And it's a very powerful argument, and it's worked in a lot of places. But some have interpreted that to mean if it's not cost effective, you can't do it. And so they've created this extremely rigid standard for justifying energy efficiency. And I've even heard people say, oh, well, we're being risk averse. You know, we want to avoid the risk of spending too much money on energy efficiency. And while that's a reasonable approach, you have to recognize that there's also the other risk, whereas if you underinvest in energy efficiency, then you're going to have to overinvest on the supply side. So there's really no way out. And I don't know exactly, you know, each state probably has its own story, but the message we're trying to give here is that getting it as understanding it and explaining it and deciding upon it with as much information as possible is the best way to go.
You mentioned proxies. Can you give an example or two of where a proxy is used so that a better sense concretely of what you mean by that?
Yeah. One that's cited a lot has to do with risk, the risk benefits of energy efficiency. And first I'll say that the risk benefits should be seen as net. You know, there are some ways in which efficiency might increase risks on the system, but there's also ways that it might reduce risk. In general, though, it's pretty widely accepted that efficiency is a net reduction in risks. And states wrestle with, well, what do we do about that? How do we capture it? And Vermont, several years ago, maybe even over 10 years ago, issued an order saying, we recognize this is very real, it's significant, we don't have a good number, but we're going to increase the benefits by 5% to reflect that risk. Another example I've seen is some states have decided to increase their avoided costs to reflect the non-energy benefits of efficiency programs. Sometimes it'll be like a 10, 20, maybe 25% increase in the avoided costs. I've found that when compared to actual numbers that some states come up with, those proxies tend to be very, very low. And then the third example is a lot of states might use a proxy to represent low-income benefits, because those are widely accepted as very real, hard to quantify, and so they'll just throw a proxy.
Like a percentage or?
Yeah, I think I've seen maybe 15% adder to the benefits. And the thing is, there are some states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island are some of the leaders on this, who will do studies to come up with actual values for low-income benefits, and they're much, much greater than those kind of proxies that you see. Well, you know, typically, once you get the information in front of you, you have a much better sense of what the numbers really are.
Thanks. So you're talking about developing methodologies and inputs for all impacts, including hard to quantify, and that seems like it would involve a lot of research and potentially jurisdiction-specific studies. You know, what's going on with these people and these participants and with regard to these measures. I mean, isn't that time-consuming and expensive? And can you talk about any ways to kind of keep the cost down and get reasonable numbers without breaking the bank or burdening program administrators?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is that the information can provide value that's well beyond what it costs. In terms of any state that has a reasonably sized efficiency program, some of these studies can be done, as part of their EM&D practices at fairly low cost. But no question, we all want to keep costs down, and there are ways. One great example I point to a lot is for the avoided cost analysis. In New England, we have this avoided energy supply cost study group that does one study. It covers all 6 states, and it has representatives from all 6 states. It's got representatives on the steering committee from consumer advocates, commissions, environmental advocates, utilities, and it's a great way to pool funds to come up with highly credible and very comprehensive numbers. And that kind of approach can be used in lots of ways. If you're in a large state with 4 utilities, it makes a whole lot of sense for all 4 utilities to pool their funds and come up with estimates of non-energy benefits. And in doing that, the first thing that they would do is a literature search to see what other states similar to them have already done and build off of that. So there are ways to do this without breaking the bank. It just needs to be done thoughtfully.
One more question. They'll plow on. But the idea that this idea that individual energy efficiency projects have to show their economic justification could be because it benefits the individual, not the utility. So if there's a benefit to the utility, and with that, the utilities have a public benefit requirement, and maybe some of that statutory language or mission causes this. What you might call conservatism in the justification. Do you think that there's something to that, or is it?
I do. I think a lot of people come to this topic with the assumption that the primary reason for the efficiency programs is to help out the participants lower their bills, keep them more comfortable, make them more productive, all the rest, and that's all fine, but that's really the goal. And if that's your primary way of seeing this, then I can see why you might want to be very cautious about how much you spend on it. However, if you recognize that efficiency is a resource, principle number one in the manual, you'll see that the main reason for doing it is for avoiding costs on the system, lowering costs for everybody. Now, when you start with the utility cost test and just use those utility system benefits, that tells you exactly how much you're lowering costs for everybody. Once you start adding on the non-utility system impacts, this kind of gets more to the heart of the issue, then suddenly there might be some customers who see more benefits than others. And that raises the equity issue. And no question, that's an issue, and it's something that needs to be considered as one sort of walks through these steps. I will say that the main driving issue behind equity has to do with rate impacts. What that really boils down to is if you spend too much money, let's just call it too much, hypothetically, on energy efficiency, and that causes rates to go up, sure, the participants will see lower bills because they've saved energy, but the people who don't participate are just going to see higher rates, and that's it. And that's a big sticking point. And what we recommend, and this goes to, actually, I'm going to skip to it real quick since you asked. It's at the very end of the manual, because it's in Appendix C. This slide 29 talks about why you shouldn't use the rate impact measure test, but then we talk about what are better options to deal with rate impacts, because this is the issue. And it comes up in every state, and it's going to come up with DERs. In fact, it is the issue driving the debate around rooftop solar, is cost shifting and rate impacts. And so we don't think you should shy away from it. We don't think you should try to dodge the issue. It requires a comprehensive analysis of three things: the rate impacts, the bill impacts, and participant impacts. And by rate impacts, I mean a long-term assessment of how rates can be increased because of the efficiency cost, but also reduced as a result of avoided cost. And you want to get that net effect. So many times people do this, they just look at the increase from the efficiency cost. But no, you've got to get the benefits in there too. That's key. Secondly, to look at the bill impacts to see how much bills are going down and for whom. But third, and this is so important, is participation. Because all you have to do is to participate, and usually it just requires a handful of light bulbs or a very small change to your consumption to offset all the rate impacts that you might have, and to look at this. And so, as we say here in the slide, the participant impacts are key to understanding the extent to which efficiency resources are being adopted and to the extent that there is a cost shifting or an equity concern. And if and I've done some of these analyses and shown that in those states where there is fairly aggressive efficiency programs and where you might expect there to be an equity issue, that the majority, even the vast majority of customers participate over time. So if you have that, then you've really addressed the issue head on.
So one participant who I think a public power entity raises this issue of cost shifting and whether there are specific requirements for public power related to fair allocation of expenses. And I guess I wonder if you've ever dealt with that and whether the rate analysis that you were just talking about kind of deals with that, or maybe doesn't.
Well, I would say that everything I just said applies to any type of efficiency program that's offered by some sort of utility or energy service provider. Yes, public power authorities have different guiding principles and different statutory requirements, and they also have a different decision-making process in terms of boards as opposed to commissions. But every one of these concepts applies there as well. I don't see any difference. And, what might be different is they might have a different set of policy goals. And the other thing is, equity is a goal as well, customer equity. And, a regulatory commission has certain requirements there. Sometimes it's all bundled up into the term just and reasonable rate. But a public power authority might have a different standard for what's equity, and they might even have a different standard for some of the goals, whether it's environmental or jobs or whatever. So back to the steps I was going through. I'm just about done here. I'm going to talk about the last step, which is step 7, ensuring transparency. You know, we have in the report a template that we suggest people use. This is just really an excerpt from it on the slide in front of you. And it's really just to make sure that the decisions that are made for coming up with your test are clear. And so we suggest that at the top part of this template you list all the utility system costs, all the benefits, then you have a section on non-utility costs and benefits, and then you have a section on societal costs and benefits, and then finally on non-monetized considerations, so that any qualitative or quantitative information I mentioned earlier is laid out here and that you can see it. And just a couple other points on this is that transparency does require a certain amount of stakeholder input, and there's a whole variety of ways this can be done through rulemakings, generic dockets, working groups, and also, you know, the objectives should be, we mentioned many times, should be driven by policy, but, you know, policies evolve over time, and there's, as we mentioned earlier, room to interpret policy, so that's why these stakeholder discussions are important. And so, and finally, there might be other government agencies, Department of Environmental Protection, for example, that would have some important things to say about the goals, and so maybe they should be brought in as well. And so the idea here is that transparency isn't just in the numbers that you finally come up with, but it's in the decision-making process that you use to come up with your primary test.
With regard to the benefits side, I've been thinking about the connection with IRP and resource planning, and whether you can comment on that. And in particular, one of the participants raised the question of whether resource savings can justify EE where load is flat or declining. So you have electricity demand flat or declining, and you know, therefore you're maybe not avoiding new capacity, or you know, kind of might have to think about the benefits side differently, or not.
Yeah. So there's two questions there. I'll unravel it. First, IRP, and so what we recommend here in terms of our principles and concepts are all applicable to IRP, and it's applicable to efficiency resources, distributed energy resources, to supply-side resources. So anything that's done here could be applied there in the same way. It's a little trickier in some ways. It's the thing about IRP often it's done through models where it's hard to capture some of the nuances that one captures with a standalone cost-benefit analysis, but the concepts here are all applicable there as well. To the second point on, I'm sorry, what was the second point?
Well, if the electric system is facing flat or declining future load,
yep,
then how does that affect ADE?
So what that affects really is some of the inputs. And the energy inputs, the avoided energy costs, they might be lower than otherwise, but they're still going to be avoided energy costs. The avoided capacity costs, generation capacity, maybe there aren't any for the next 10, 15 years or so, but you put them in anyways, and they'll have some impact on the net present value. The same is true with transmission distribution capacity costs. You put in the best numbers you have. Hey, if the numbers are low, the numbers are low, but that's something that you want to look at. And I would say we don't have time to go into the discount rate discussion much, but I will say that's extremely relevant here because we recommend that, we lay out a lot of reasons why the utility weighted average cost of capital is simply too high for this purpose, and provide all reasons for that. And a lower one is much more representative of the goals that, the goals are really the screening, and of the regulatory perspective, which I'll get to in a minute. And so if states do care about long-term, then that can be reflected in lower discount rates, and then it will, those long-term benefits will be captured much better.
Yeah, we've been looking at the cost of energy efficiency programs, and it seems like they're in the ballpark of 3 cents a kilowatt hour, plus or minus, and you know, at that at that level of levelized cost, it seems like displacing just fuel costs could actually justify the program.
Yeah, the trick there is that 3 cents is an average of a range of programs that cost from 1 cent to 12 cents to 15 cents. And it's those ones that cost 12 to 15 cents that kind of are on the chopping block that you want to make sure you have a good assessment of. So a couple more points I think are important just to kind of close this up. In the California manual, there's the 3 tests, utility cost, TRC, societal, and they are defined as representing 3 different perspectives. The first one is the utility system, all the costs and benefits to the utility. The second one is the utility system plus the participant, and the third one is the societal perspective. And this notion of perspectives really is fundamental to those tests. It's also fundamental to the discount rates that are used for these tests. And what we add to this discussion, a fundamental shift in thinking, which is there's another perspective, and we call that the regulatory perspective. And by regulatory, we mean that broadly. We mean utility commissions, legislators, boards, public power authorities, whoever's making the decisions. And they have a different perspective than the utility plus participant, or all of society. Their perspective is driven by their policy goals. First of all, their statutory mandates, but secondly, their policy goals. And it might be different from these other 3 perspectives. And what this does is it allows it opens up the discussion for the ability to create a test that's not one of these 3 tests, but is in fact better reflects the most important perspectives for this purpose. So last 2 slides, or literally the last 1 slide, I'll just kind of bring this all together to show how this can play out. On this slide, we have 6 circle charts, and this is just to illustrate how the primary test, and we use the term resource value test is just the term we use for that, to show how this might play out. And so each of these circles represents a different jurisdiction that came up with a different test. The bottom 3 are the familiar, the traditional tests. The bottom left-hand one, well, first of all, you'll notice they all have utility system impacts as the core, because, as I said earlier, that's the foundation for every test that should be used. For the one at the bottom left, the utility cost test, that's it. You stop there, nothing else is added. For the total resource cost test, you add other fuel impacts, water impacts. These occur to participants. Participant impacts, low-income participant impacts, that's kind of the standard approach for the TRC test. Not universal, but that's standard. And then the societal cost test, you include them all, public health impacts, jobs, and so forth. So one could go through the steps that we just described and end up with any one of these 3 tests. And if that meets their policy goals and is consistent with what they want to do, great, they're done. But in my experience, it probably won't. And they might end up with one of these. And the ones at the top are just jurisdictions that have different priorities. The one on the left is concerned with other fuel impacts. They want to minimize consumption of oil and so forth. And the other thing about other fuel impacts is if you're doing any kind of fuel switching or fuel optimization or addressing climate change, you kind of have to do that. And water impacts. And so in this case, they also were concerned about environmental. So those 3 were chosen, the others were not. And then you can walk through the other 2 and see how those different jurisdictions chose different policy goals and therefore different tests.
So we're almost out of time. I just have one question. I was wondering, Tim, about the application of this. Out there in the States and in with utility commissions and utility firms, is anybody, who's doing this, and is anyone doing it well?
So yeah, first point is, like, across the country, whether you're talking about states, territories, whatever, or municipals, or this is done differently, like everywhere. There's very little consistency. And several states do a fairly good job of this, and several states do a pretty bad job, in my view. And so there are some that are sort of applying the California test fairly well, others not so much. So even before we wrote the manual, that was the case. And I'd point to some states that I happen to know well. Massachusetts, I think, has a very good, solid practice here. They have a TRC test, but they also include non-energy benefits, probably better than any other state. Vermont has chosen to do a societal cost test, and I think they include all these benefits pretty well. So there's some states that have done that. And then more recently, and I will say there's several states we're working in that are in the process of updating their tests. I can think of Oregon and Arkansas and Maryland and several others, California of all. And they are looking to this manual to help do that. And then the one that I'm most familiar with is Rhode Island. Recently went through a process just last winter of updating its manual, its own test to reflect, first of all, new realities, but also to be able to be applied to all distributed energy resources. And in that case, they pretty much went through the same process. They had a draft of the report. I was a part of the discussions, and they came up with what they call the Rhode Island test. And I would say that they have, and even in their manuals, which is kind of like the regulations, they adopted the 6 principles from the manual word for word. So it's another example of how this is working out. We hope other states will pick it up and follow a similar example.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim. This has been really interesting. I think we'll have to come back at this in a future webinar and get into the part 2 of the manual and some of the more applying these principles and examples. And thanks a lot. And thanks to everyone out there on the telephone and webinar land. Our next third Thursday energy analysis webinar will be on November 16th, 2 o'clock. So look for email from us about that. Sign up and tell your friends. Thanks.